therapies that promote remyelination and repair in diseases such as multiple sclerosis and in the development of better non-addictive pain medications. She's also a mother of 2 teenagers, juggling work-life balance. Our panelists include Dr. Alex Guerin. So he's a research fellow in youth mental health at the University of Melbourne here in Australia, right, same campus I am. After completing his PhD at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health in 2021, he joined the Substance Use Research Group at Origin, where he currently manages a number of studies and clinical trials. Dr. Guerin is a proud member of the LGBTQIA+ community. Heather McPherson is a second-year PhD student in the Functional Neuromodulation Novel Therapeutics Laboratory at the Queensland Brain Institute, QBI. That's at the University of Queensland. After being diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2017, she switched her career path from medicine to neuroscience. Her research focuses on sleep, melatonin, and mood dysregulation with the aim of improving diagnosis and treatment of bipolar disorder. Our third panelist, Associate Professor Ji-Hyun Kim, is head of molecular psychiatry laboratory at the Institute for Mental and Physical Health and Clinical Translation at Deakin University, which is down in Geelong, pretty near us here in Melbourne. She studies the neurobiology of age-specific memory and health and disease using cells, rodents, and humans. Associate Professor Kim has won numerous national and international awards for her groundbreaking work and is a passionate science communicator. Sophie Matheson is coming to us from the University of Otago, Ngāpuhi Ngāti Hine. Sophie is a Kaiawhina Kaifakako, that's an Indigenous support teaching fellow at the University of Otago, and works at the Aotearoa Brain Project. So that's Kopapa Ro Aotearoa. She's passionate about advancing outcomes and reducing inequities for Maori and Pacific peoples in New Zealand, both for those working in the brain health space, so those are the students, the researchers, the clinicians, and the support groups, and for those in the community who are affected by brain health conditions. So coming to you as I am from the University of Melbourne, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded lands traditionally looked after by the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and the same would apply to Alex, who's on the same campus as I am. G is coming to us from unceded Wadawurrung country, down around the bay in Geelong, also in Victoria, and Heather's joining us from the unceded lands of the Turrbal and Jagara people up in Brisbane. So now I'd like to turn things over to our panelists, who will each take a bit of time to introduce themselves in more detail, to talk a little bit about their own journeys, and to talk about some of the perspectives that they may be able to share with you today, starting with Sophie, if you'd like to take over.
Thank you, Ethan. I will just get my screen going. Hopefully you can see that without my presenter view on the way. Kia ora, ko poiroa te manga, ko ora uta te awa, ko ngā toki matawharua te waka, ko otiria te marae, ko Ngāpuhi te iwi, ko Ngāti Hine te hapu, no Otepoti o hou, ko Sophie Matheson toki ingoa. Kia ora koutou, hi everybody, my name is Sophie Matheson and I have just given you my pepeha, which is the way of introducing yourself when you are Māori from New Zealand, by way of introducing the lands of where you have come from as Māori. The Māori are the Indigenous people of New Zealand, and you can see in the translation that I've acknowledged the mountain and the river from where my tribe Ngāpuhi originates, and the boat or the waka on which my ancestors travelled to Aotearoa, the marae or the meeting house on the land where my ancestors would have lived, acknowledging the name of my tribe and my sub-tribe. And then I've said I am from Dunedin, which is actually where I am currently. That's not where my tribe originates from. They are from the very north of the North Island, and I'm kind of at the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand currently in a slightly colder place of Dunedin. And I am going to talk to you about my mahi or my work that I do at the University of Otago in Dunedin. So I'm a person currently who has quite a few hats on. So I am kind of a fifth year, I suppose, PhD candidate. My PhD was put on pause last year to take on full-time work, but I'm kind of slowly ticking away at it. So I've been doing a PhD in neuroscience. I'm also, as Ethan said, a Kaiwhina Kaiwhakaako, which translates to Indigenous Support Teaching Fellow. And so I work in the Department of Psychology, and I support our Māori and some of our Pacific Island students to help their way through their degrees. I've put our traditional University of Otago logo on here, if I can get my laser pointer on. This is our traditional University of Otago logo, but we're actually going to transition to our new logo with our new Māori name for the university in the middle of next year, which is really exciting. And in the other half of my time, I'm a business support coordinator, i.e. an admin who does a lot of things for the Aotearoa Brain Project, Kaupapa or Aotearoa. So that second part is the Māori translation of our name, and it essentially means kaupapa is kind of like project or topic, and roro means brain, and then of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I am speaking as a Māori Indigenous person from New Zealand. I would just like to say that these are my own views. I'm certainly not kind of an expert in this area. This is just my perspective from my different kind of areas as a PhD student and the staff. And I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of any Indigenous populations of Australia or anywhere else in Oceania. This is just my perspective as Māori. Let's see if I can change. There we go. So a bit of background. I'm going to talk about kind of the trials and the triumphs of being a Māori in academia in neuroscience in New Zealand. So just some background is that Māori make up 17% of Aotearoa's population, which is a pretty decent proportion. It's one of the highest in terms of Indigenous populations. But however, when we go into a tertiary institution, only 5% of our academics and 12% of our students, our tauira, are Māori. So these numbers are increasing very slowly, but it will be a while before we are up at that 17% representation that is present in the general population. So I just want to talk briefly about a few challenges that we face as Māori in academia or science or neuroscience. And the first of these is that we are often we are often required to work what has been termed the cultural double shift. So we are working a regular shift as an academic, doing our research, our teaching, and our service responsibilities, and then we are working a second shift as a cultural expert. So the onus is often put on Māori to be the educators of all things Māori, with a reliance on individuals to build the relationships that should really be the responsibility of either the individuals themselves. There are plenty of resources that they can use to educate themselves, at least somewhat, or the responsibility of the institutions that sometimes put some policies in place and then don't really think through the actual carrying out of these policies. This work is often expected of our Māori academics and yet isn't paid, and leads to a culture of overwork and burnout in Māori. And this also applies to our other Indigenous groups like Pacific peoples who work in New Zealand and those kind of things. Secondly, we have to deal with disrespect or dismissal of our knowledge, our identities and beliefs. And I've written on the slide here, mātauranga Māori, which means Māori knowledge and Māori identity. Universities, as we all are aware, are pretty much entirely built on a knowledge system that inherently privileges and values a Western understanding of learning and teaching. And while our academic freedom can be somewhat protected if we're doing peer review publishing, especially in groups, this often doesn't protect people's individual views or identity. And even though the overarching strategic direction of many New Zealand institutions is kind of moving towards the integration of Western and Māori knowledge bases, on an individual basis, there are still many people who are opposed to these ideas and some who are very much not afraid to share them. And speaking up regarding either the overt or the covert discrimination that happens within these institutions is an extremely difficult position for an Indigenous person to put themselves in, with or without Pākehā or non-Māori allies. We're all trying to pave our own paths and build our own careers, and being someone who can challenge the status quo is really scary and often leaves people being labelled as difficult, and can later lead to being shut out of situations or opportunities. There's lots of times when we just have to pick our battles and bite our tongues, and kind of privilege ourselves for a bit, so that we can continue to help the collective. And then finally, I've put changing the narrative. So a lot of statistics love to kind of use the deficit framing, all the things that are wrong with Māori, why are they like this, why are they like that, using stereotypes and blame, using the kind of 5 Ds, which are disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and different. Why are Māori all those things? And so we kind of have the battle of trying to change the narrative of that, moving towards an acknowledgement of the historic inequities that have led to the current situation. But it isn't all doom and gloom. There are heaps of things that Aotearoa is doing as a country that are like really actually amazing, and we are kind of the forefront of some of these Indigenous rightings of wrongs. And one of these things is by increasing te tiriti partnerships and building whakawhanaungatanga. So te tiriti refers to the Treaty of Waitangi, which I'll explain a bit more in a second. But I've used the phrase te tiriti partnerships here, which refers to joint partnership between Māori and non-Māori, a concept which some of you might be familiar with as co-governance, but this is a term that has become kind of politically loaded recently in New Zealand. And whakawhanaunga is the Māori principle of relationships and reciprocity. And it really is a cornerstone of the Māori worldview. Even in Western culture, we kind of have the phrase, it's not what you know, but who you know. And that is something very much that Māori live by. It's all about relationships. It's all about knowing who you're talking to, knowing who you're working with. So as I said, te tiriti refers to the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a treaty that was signed in 1840 by British colonists and Māori, and it was intended to protect the rights of Māori in Aotearoa, but instead it has been quite egregiously misinterpreted across the years and used against Māori for many, many decades. And only kind of now, in the past few decades, I guess, we've been coming around to these te tiriti partnership arrangements where we have lots of organisations, including governmental and NGOs, that are adopting organisational structures that specifically leave equal numbers of seats at the table for Māori and for non-Māori. And that's so the Māori voice, in terms of the 17% of the population, is actually ending up overrepresented in a way that can correct these historical wrongs and make sure the Māori voice is heard. For example, in our Aotearoa Brain Project, we have this 50-50 governance structure that we've designed, and we call it our waka. So it's our boat, and we have 2 hulls of our boat. We have our tangata whenua, our Māori hull, and our tangata tiriti or treaty partners, non-Māori hull. All right. We also in New Zealand have legislative science policy, which helps keep scientists on track. And so this is something that has been in place since 2010, and it is called a vision mātauranga policy, so the vision of Māori knowledge. And this is designed to make sure that scientists are engaging with Māori in science and innovation by unlocking the innovation potential of Māori knowledge, resources, and people. So in practice, this means that when applying for grants funded by government agencies in New Zealand, how the research is actually going to address the themes of the Vision Mātauranga policy is taken into consideration in the grant. So the way this might actually look in research can be hugely varied for projects that might impact Māori only in the sense that they will hopefully kind of be of general benefit to Aotearoa, so that's kind of the minimum level, all the way to what we call kaupapa Māori research, which is my next point. And as I described earlier, kaupapa just kind of means project or topic, and kaupapa Māori research is described as being by Māori, with Māori, and for Māori. So very much Māori are embedded in every layer of the research projects if they're a kaupapa Māori project. This is research that is usually either entirely conducted by a full Māori research team or at least led by a Māori investigator. There may be other non-Māori working with them. It's usually carried out in collaboration with Māori communities, often stemming from a research idea that is kind of synthesized by the investigator, but then can be completely guided and maybe completely changed by what the communities are actually wanting and needing. This research is grounded in Mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge and tikanga, which is Māori practices, and uses kaupapa Māori methodologies to actually carry out the research. And that kind of leads into this point, which is rangatiratanga over Māori data. So for many years as an underprivileged community, if Māori were ever involved in research, they were often just passive contributors from which information could be extracted and then used however the scientists saw fit. Māori consider their data and their knowledge as kind of the highest taonga or a treasure, so kind of their most precious material. And the Western scientific model doesn't often put the data safety and ownership as a priority. So one of the articles of Te Tiriti of the treaty recognises the right of Māori to retain tino rangatiratanga, which means the kind of highest power of jurisdiction or sovereignty over their taonga, over their treasures. So because knowledge is a treasure, this applies very much to the data collected from Māori if they are used, if they are involved in research. And this is actually something that's being much more carefully navigated now during study design and completion. So whoever has the kaitiakitanga, which means the kind of guardianship over the data, is also something that needs to be planned with Māori and is being considered a lot more now. And then finally, just very briefly mention, we do have lots of really wonderful equity programs in Aotearoa. So I was privileged to get a PhD scholarship that was specifically for Māori PhD applicants. We also have things like, at Otago at least, we have something called the Māori Health Workforce Development Unit, which is led by a Māori academic, and I think all of their staff are Māori. And this is to help our students who are Māori and Pacific navigate their way through the professional programs like medicine and dentistry and physiotherapy, keeps the retention really high through these programs, and make sure the students leave university fully ready to be fantastic physicians or whatever in our communities. Okay, and I'm way over my 5 minutes, so I'm going to very, very briefly talk about this amazing wahine woman that I have had the privilege to work with quite a few times. She's on our governance waka for our Aotearoa Brain Project, and that is Dr. Macarena Dudley, and she is here in the black t-shirt, and this is a photo of her with a group of kaumātua who are elders from the community where she grew up in Kaitaia, which is way up in the north of New Zealand. And I don't know how Macarena has managed this, but she has done an absolutely incredible amount of work in the last few years. So what she has done is mostly related to mate wariwari, which is the Māori translation for the word dementia. So mate means sickness and wariwari means forgetting. So it's sickness of forgetting. And what Macarena has done, very briefly, she has helped develop the Dementia Mate Wariwari Action Plan to present to the government to help with the strategic funding and things for dementia research. She has also helped develop this, well, almost entirely developed this Mate Wariwari app. So what she did was kaupapa Māori research. She went to her communities and she talked to kaumātua and to whānau families about their experiences with dementia. And then she turned this into an app that can be used for people at all different levels of the whānau. So rangatahi, who are young people in the family, all the way up to kaumātua, the elders who might be developing dementia themselves. She has also helped develop a cognitive stimulation therapy program for Māori who are already developing dementia, and this uses things like sharing traditional food, making music with traditional instruments, listen to traditional songs, sharing traditional stories, things from the childhood or the younger lives of these Māori who are developing dementia to help with their to help promote their memory. And if all that wasn't enough, she has also helped develop what is called the MANA tool, which stands for Māori Assessment of Neuropsychological Abilities tool. And MANA is kind of the Māori word for prestige. So it's a pretty cool acronym. It's like, if you have MANA, you have like great power and great prestige, and you're a very honourable person. And this is actually a bilingual screening tool that is used to assess for dementia in Māori, which was again developed by doing interviews with kaumātua about their experiences with mate wariwari, and involves some kind of fairly Western elements, but then more culturally relevant elements, such as doing things like reciting pepeha, like I did at the beginning of my talk. All right, so that was me. Sorry, I'm so over time. There are my email addresses and our website for our Aotearoa Brain Project, and we're on Facebook and LinkedIn as well if you'd like to check us out. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you, Sophie. That was fantastic. Our next panelist is Heather McPherson. Heather, do you want to share your screen?
That was amazing, Sophie. So it's going to be hard to follow up on that. But hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning into our webinar. I feel very lucky to be able to present for you all today. So my name's Heather, and I'll be discussing disability and accessibility issues faced by neuroscientists in Oceania. It's going to work. There we go. So for a bit of background, I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Queensland, and I suffer from bipolar disorder type 1 with psychosis and mixed episodes, anxiety, autism, and I have an auditory processing disorder associated with the autism. I also have dissociative episodes where I completely separate from myself. So someone once said that I have mental illness bingo, and I think that's pretty accurate. So for my PhD, I am focusing on exploring the role of sleep disturbance as a main causal mechanism of bipolar disorder. So I'm actually trying to turn my lived experience into something positive. I am personally very, very lucky to be in an incredibly supportive lab, the Functional Neuromodulation and Novel Therapeutics Lab at QBI. But most disabled or mentally ill neuroscientists in Australia do face great challenges. So I've listed a few of them here. I could probably talk about it for ages. So a big stigma. Now, I'll give an example. I've actually had people say to me that patients with bipolar disorder are unstable and dangerous. This sort of stigma can make it really hard for some people to talk about having an illness or a disability. And for a long time, I was actually scared of announcing that I had bipolar disorder, knowing that some people would immediately judge me as a crazy person, when my condition is just like any other chronic illness in so many ways. So another issue is lack of knowledge about the condition. So for instance, people often think that medicated patients have no symptoms, and this is for a lot of different disabilities, this is not the case. Personally, I have mood instability pretty much all the time. It might be subsubdrenal, but it's still there. And stress can still trigger a full relapse. So medication doesn't fully, quash it, unfortunately. Another issue is lack of accessibility. So the example I give is not providing safe spaces. This can refer to a lot of things. But for instance, if I have a dissociative or an anxious episode at work, it would be nice to have a physical safe space where I can be away from people, just a room. That would be great. And I think this would actually be really useful for a lot of people. Another one is lack of understanding or empathy. So for example, not allowing someone with a mental illness to have a sick day because they're not physically unwell. Yeah, this is terrible. And also stress or pressure, as stress can trigger relapses. A good example would be having strict deadlines with no flexibility. So yeah, these are our main challenges. Now, in Australia, there are a lot of things regarding mental health and disability support that I think are done well. So the government provides affordable basic mental health care to all Australians via the mental health care plan. So they actually give 10 free therapy sessions for all Australians. You just go to a GP, they'll give you this plan, and then boom, you've got your 10 free sessions. A lot of university institutes also provide free therapy sessions for their staff and for their students as well. For the staff, they've got something called the EAP, and that gives you 12 free therapy sessions. So it's actually very accessible for the basic treatment. Unfortunately, more complicated treatment, like the kind that I have, is still quite expensive. It's subsidized by Medicare, but that is something I'd like to see change in the future. Would be, maybe making that a little bit cheaper and accessible for people as well. But for general psychotherapy, we do have quite a lot of options. The government has also put in place effective safeguards and anti-discrimination laws. So that's really useful. It means that I know I don't have to state my disabilities when I'm applying for work, and that when I start working, I'll be able to tell my boss that I have these disabilities and these needs without actually risking my job. So this is a really great thing that we've done. All Australian universities and most large institutes also have heaps of guidelines in place to help departments and labs be accessible for staff and students with disabilities. These are usually really easy to find and understand, and they provide information like how to make a website accessible for people with visual disabilities and things like that. Staff and students can also access a wealth of support, things like counselling, legal and financial support, and all of the websites and campuses are very carefully designed to be accessible. So, physical campuses often have wheelchair ramps and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, all the websites have been designed to help people with learning disabilities or visual disabilities or auditory. So there's a lot that's going on there, which is really fantastic. And finally, I would say that there is Finally, I would say that there is good awareness about mental health and disabilities in Australia, so that people do know it's an issue and that people suffer from these kinds of illnesses, even if they are lacking on understanding. So people do know, it's something to worry about. So there are frequent campaigns and events that help raise awareness, such as Are You OK Day or Invisible Disabilities Week. So that's out there. We can, however, there's a lot that we can definitely do better. So my recommendations, top 5 recommendations would be flexibility in working hours. So making it easier for staff to take time off if a condition has a flare-up. So flare-ups are really common with disabilities, and even with me with a psychiatric disability, I can be fine and then have all these things planned, and then suddenly out of nowhere, boom, I have a flare-up and I just can't do things for a couple of weeks, and that's really, really common. So having flexibility allows to an accommodation for those big flare-ups and things. And also being able to reduce your hours as needed. So potentially being able to apply to reduce your hours for maybe a couple of months or something like that to accommodate a really big flare up or things like that. And what I'd also really like to see would be increased opportunities for part-time staff. So a lot of people with disabilities, they can work, but they often can't work at a full-time level. I know that's a recommendation I've been given multiple times, is to have a part-time life. So I'd like to see more scientists, scientific positions have part-time options. Education's a really big one. So educating staff, especially PIs and other higher ups, would be amazing on issues faced by people with disabilities and what needs to be done to facilitate a supportive environment. So we do need definitely a lot more of this. We also need to promote transparency. So make people feel as though they can talk about their physical or mental health issues, so that they feel like if they have an issue, if they have a problem, they can talk to someone and receive empathy and understanding is very important. Also, reducing personal responsibility and pressure, I think, is something that needs to be done. So that means, making sure that staff are trained on multiple techniques and projects. So if someone suddenly can't do a project, another person in the team can actually pick up the slack. So that's something that's really important, because a lot of people in it's definitely neuroscience, they kind of silo themselves off to a particular project. So it'd be good if we kind of see more sharing of the load, just in case something like that happens, to help accommodate for people with disabilities. And also generally reducing stress as much as possible. This is something that we're always going to say, but it is extremely important, because like I said, flare-ups are a big issue. Now, if you'd like more tips on how to improve accessibility, the ALBA Disability Working Group, which I'm also a part of, has been publishing short videos discussing common challenges for neuroscientists and tips on how to fix them. So this is the link, and I can pop it in the chat as well, if you guys are curious. So we're publishing them fairly frequently. But yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. And here are some links if you'd like to get in touch with me or learn a bit more about what my lab does. So I've put my X handle, because they changed the name, and website and a few other things as well. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, I really admire and appreciate your willingness to bring this up, to talk openly about it, and to take the issue of stigma head on. It's very valuable for others. So thank you for that. Next, we'll go over to Alex Guerin. Alex, take it away.
I will share my screen. That should be all good now. Yeah. Great presentation, Sophie and Heather. I'm going to keep mine a little bit shorter, and I guess if you have any questions, if anyone in the audience has any questions, we can talk about those a little bit later. I just want to briefly introduce myself. So my name's Alex. I'm from... Oh, one second. There we go. I come from this beautiful small city in southern France called Toulouse. I grew up there and spent a lot of my youth between Toulouse and Hamburg, Germany. So my parents worked in both cities. So I went back and forth quite a lot until I was about 13, which is when my dad moved to China. So I spent the rest of my childhood there, went to middle school and high school in Tianjin, which is a very, very large city, not too far from Beijing on the coast of China. And after high school, I decided to move to the opposite side of the world, to the University of Melbourne. And from this point onwards, my journey is a little bit boring because I did my undergrad at the University of Melbourne, then I did my honours year at the University of Melbourne, then I stayed in the same lab with G, actually, at the University of Melbourne for my PhD, and now I still work here at the University of Melbourne. So I've been here for 13 years now and really love it here, clearly. I am currently a research fellow at the Centre for Youth Mental Health. And my work primarily deals with young people who use substances. So I work with Headspace centres in northwestern Melbourne, run a number of clinical trials to try to help young people manage their substance use. Before we get into it, I just want to put up a bit of a disclaimer. What I'm going to talk about today in this little introduction and also during a Q&A is very much my own experience as a member of the LGBTQI+ community in Australia. So it's very important to note I am quite privileged as a cis white male. And my experience is definitely not the same as other people from the community, and also not the same as people from other countries. I'm not sure what the situation is in New Zealand, and also not the same as other people in other Australian cities. So I'm very, very privileged to live in Melbourne, which is quite progressive. So I can't really speak on anyone else's experiences. So please do keep that in mind. And also I think it's important to bring up that my experience during my PhD and now is also very, very different. I slightly moved fields, so I went from neuroscience to very much the medical field. So I work in psychiatry now, and my experience was a bit different, but I guess we can talk about this during the panel. Questions? Now, I just want to talk very briefly about some of the challenges I've been facing in the last few years. One of them is being defined by my sexuality, and that's something that still happens to this day. Being referred to as the gay researcher rather than as my research expertise, if that makes sense. That still happens. That's not something that's necessarily specific to neuroscience, but just work and life in general. This worry to always accidentally come out myself. In professional settings. So I always try to be as careful as possible, always refer to my partner or use non-gendered language when referring to my partner. I never say, my boyfriend. I just say, oh, yes, I went out with them this weekend, things like that, to try not to out myself, just because I don't know what people's responses would be. And yeah, that's exactly what I said. Not sure about how people would react. Once again, very lucky in Melbourne, very lucky at the University of Melbourne, because most people are quite tolerant and open-minded, but you just never know. And that's especially true at conferences. And when going to conferences overseas, I always try to not accidentally out myself. What can we do better in Australia? There is still quite a long way to go, I think. As I said, we do a lot of things very well, and I'm very happy to talk about these things during the panel. I think there's a couple of questions about that. But in terms of what we can do better, there is still a long way to go to create a very inclusive workplace. A very great example is gender neutral bathrooms. That's really starting to catch on here in Australia, and my current workplace has gender-neutral bathrooms. But the University of Melbourne, I think, is still not quite there yet, for example. Another big one is less tokenistic representation in events. I feel like, and that's not just related to the LGBTQI community, it's the same with disability and other things like that. There's just too many of those like random morning teas where we're just going to have a 15-minute presentation on, oh, we have LGBTQI people at work, and then that's it. And people will just go back to work. One that comes to mind immediately is Wear It Purple Day. I'm not sure if that's something you have in New Zealand, but pretty much every year it's nearly always the same, where you just change your Zoom background and then have a morning tea that is pretty much only attended by people from the community or people who are very much strong allies, and not the people who should be attending, if that makes sense. So what I would love to see is having more senior researchers and also leadership of our unis and institutes attend these events, just to show their support, really, and not just make it a 15-minute morning tea with cupcakes. And another big one that really bothers me is we need to stop using gendered language all the time. It still happens in meetings when people say, hi guys, or hello ladies. There's no need for that. Just use the word people. And respect people's choices. As I said, I am a cis male, so my pronouns are he and him. But nowadays, people are very open about their pronouns and also their preferred names. Don't question it. Just do it. Just use their preferred names, and that's it.
All right, thank you, Alex. I think those are really useful suggestions up front, and I'm sure we'll get to them more during the question session. So G, you'll be our last panelist to introduce yourself. Please go ahead.
All right. So that's been really fantastic and I've learned so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm from South Korea and I don't know if I can call myself an immigrant. This is a picture from not, recently. I mean, that is a recent picture when I was a traveler in Korea. So I don't feel quite Korean. I moved from Korea when I was 11. And for me, the culture change has been rather positive because when I was born, even though my dad looked so happy, the first thing he said, according to my mom, is that if she is stupid, I'm never paying for her college or university education. So when 30 years ago, when I was 11, moving to Australia, it was actually a quite positive change. Sydney is so beautiful and I love drafts. Taronga Zoo is the best. And for the first time, I was asked actually, what do you enjoy? So before then, even as a tiny kid, I was always told to behave and do certain things, try really, really hard so I can have a really good life later. But for me, the culture shock was actually quite positive, but I was 11. But now as a sort of senior scientist, I've I had the privilege of mentoring and supervising a lot of immigrant scientists, especially students, as well as postdocs. And I definitely see some challenges, and shout out to Trang, who helped me with some of these ideas, who's in the audience now. So it sounds obvious, but language is a challenge because it's not just one more layer of complexity that you have to deal with being an immigrant in science. And, scientific language is so hard in and of itself anyway. But also what I didn't realize without, people's input for this presentation is that there's a bias against non-English names. Actually, and I know this personally because just because my last name is Kim or my first author has a exotic name, oftentimes we get called out for having language issues, and then it'll be like one grammatical error. It's like there's a non-English this should be reviewed by or revised by an English speaking person, and we are all English speaking people in the authorship. But even if there's like an English name at the front, sometimes if there's like an ethnic mixture, especially last authorship, there's definitely this bias, as well as grants as well. And grants is a big issue there's actually study that showed, I didn't put the figure here, that shows that actually consistently Asian names get underfunded in America for the last 10 years. So language is definitely, and the bias is an issue. Practical matters, I think moving from another country is a huge deal. And housing, I was a kid, so my parents took take care of that. But housing is an issue and visa is an issue, and not just getting the visa to come here, but actually that plan to stay, once we educate our people here or we train our postdocs here, how come there's no clear path to actually get them to stay, this valuable resource? And also every housing applications or rental applications would require local references, but how? Like, you've just arrived, so I'm sure this is a huge significant challenge. And there are not many paths to secure like a permanent visa after being trained, and there's no employer sort of pathway in universities for graduates. And of course, there's culture shock and isolation. You have it's not like you don't have friends. You have friends back at home, but you've moved countries, so you lose access to all that network, not just socially, but professionally. So that's a huge challenge. And this is something I personally experienced, even though I came here so long ago, is stereotype threat. This is when we feel challenged that people are, looking at you with a certain stereotype because of how you look. And I realized that no matter how Australian I feel, that I'll always look like an Asian woman to people. And because you feel threatened and that you are being stereotyped so harshly, that as an extra layer of effort in your performance, so you actually perform less. This is a very well documented event, across countries for people who regularly get stereotyped. I didn't actually write what we do well. I think it's actually quite special that immigrant perspective has been asked. And same with Alex, this is definitely my personal opinion, and I can be very wrong. So definitely call me out. But I think it's really valuable to think about, immigrant scientist perspective and in the diversity setting. So what we do well, I wasn't actually quite sure when I was thinking about it, but I thought maybe we can discuss some potential solutions. And this was, again, not my idea, but this is actually relevant for many reasons. Double-blind reviews in grants funding system would be really excellent, because it is difficult to hide with all the career disruption information and referencing information, but it's still a step towards right way, and it sort of addresses not just immigrants, sort of marginalized people, but all the other minorities in many ways as well. Maybe we can start to offer pre-boarding classes or workshops before people actually arrive here. If we know that they have scholarship, if we know we have offered them a PhD position, a postdoc position, or like a scientist position, maybe to sort of help with the navigating of culture, what to expect with housing situations, just so that people are prepared. What funding schemes and avenues are available, what infrastructure is available in each university, and what are the future sort of visa pathway that even though you may be 4 or 5 years away, you can start working towards now. But I think one of the best things would be actually like a systemic change. So not trying to change the people who are marginalized, but more like, how can we change? How, can we educate the institutions to counter the stereotypes and subconscious biases? Yes, these are subconscious biases. Yes, we all have stereotypes even when we don't try. But we know that there have been methods, especially in psychology, that developed to actually help bring these things to awareness that can counter the biases that we may have. So I think that will be very helpful. And of course, support groups and mentoring. And this is seriously just something I just thought about what I would have found helpful if, because I did go to US as an immigrant postdoc. And, we all have these employee assist programs, and I have used it as well. But maybe instead of making an opt-in and go through all these bookings and everything, maybe already enroll people and they can just simply opt out or cancel, so that it will be increased in utility. But personally, I didn't like my employee assist program because the counselor was so remote from who I was, and the person turned up with sort of like very weird ragged pajama looking t-shirt, and it was just very strange. So maybe there's like a sort of choice in the counseling sort of that you want to receive as well. This is just the idea. Also, maybe universities can form formal immigrant support groups with diverse ethnic representation that can sort of help, because we know that with similar backgrounds, people find it easier to open up, and with a sort of expectation that if you receive that sort of help, you can also help future people as well. So these were the rough things I thought about. Thank you.
Thank you, Yi. That was really interesting. So we're going to start our question and answer sessions. So we've got a few questions to start, and please ask these in the Q&A section in the bottom, and we'll get to them as we go through. So Alex, in the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen, as a scientist, you've seen huge progress in people's awareness of different groups. So do you think we've gone far enough? Are we on the right track, or is there something that we can do to speed up the process to sort of make everything more inclusive?
It's a great question. I think we're definitely on the right track, especially here in Australia. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I spent like 8 years of my life in China, which was a little bit of a different environment for someone like me. So coming to Australia, I do think that we're definitely on the right track. And I have to say now, I feel particularly, I feel like representation, sorry, I was just reading the comments. I feel like representation is getting really, really good. And I feel like I'm a little bit biased working in psychology, psychiatry, where pretty much everyone is either a woman or a gay man. So representation at work is really great. And in my particular department, we also are really pushing strongly to include trans and gender diverse people in our research. So yes, we're on the right track. I mentioned gender neutral bathrooms earlier. It's happening all over the place. The university Union House has started to do those. We have those at work. Is there more to do? Of course, there's always more. But I think, yes, especially here in Melbourne, we're definitely on the right track. And yes, I have definitely seen the change in the last 10 years. So let's keep going.
Right, Ethan, you have a question?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Alex. And since I'm a new transplant to Melbourne, I'm pleased to see it reflected so well in your comments. It's it's promising. My question's for Heather, which is you talked about when you first tell somebody, whether it be a new boss or a new colleague, about your bipolar. Based on your own experiences, what are the reactions they can have that leave you the most reassured, the most comforted? And what reactions could they have, even if well-intended, that would have the opposite effect?
So it's funny, it's a bit like coming out as someone who's LGBT when you've got a condition like bipolar. So I call it my coming out in a lot of ways when I go and announce it to people. And it's funny when Alex was talking about, hiding that you have a partner, like not talking about the gender. I kind of do the same thing with I just mentioned I have a disability and not talk about what it is, depending on the situation. But when I announce that I have, to a boss or something, the kind of thing I want to see is empathy and understanding. And if they don't understand something, ask questions to get to clarify, and also no assumptions. So a big issue, I think, one of the bigger issues in neuroscience is that, especially when you're doing things like mental health, you might have a boss who has studied things like bipolar, and thinks they know what they're talking about. But my experience with my disease is actually very different to what you often see on paper. So definitely a lack of assumptions, and yet clarifying things. What is the kind of help that you need? What are the kind of things that you face on a day-to-day basis? How can I help you? That is what's really encouraging to me, is making sure someone goes, we want to know more about this. We want to know how to help you. And we are talking to you without judgment or assumptions.
Do you get sometimes like a deer in headlights, like, oh, don't say the wrong thing, like anxiety on their part because they don't know what to do?
I haven't had that so far. Most people have actually been really good. Especially in professional environments. So I never had an issue with my lab supervisor, who is one of the most understanding, amazing people ever. And previously I worked in government. I didn't have issues there. The most kind of the issue I've had would be, I don't really understand this condition. That's more the deer in the headlights. On a personal level, it's definitely more, I've had more of the, we think that we don't trust you. We think you're unstable. We want nothing to do with you. So thankfully I haven't had that as much in a professional environment, but definitely in a personal one. So.
Good. Well, thank you for that.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question for Sophie. So we have very few postgraduate Maori students in New Zealand, even though, like you mentioned, there are special scholarships offered specifically for Maori. So what do you believe are the major barriers for Maori students to pursue postgraduate study? How do we get more students to take up those scholarships and to get there, and how do we do that all better? And what are the barriers?
It's an interesting point because I was the only person to apply for my scholarship when I got it, so I was a shoo-in. So that was an incredible opportunity for me, but it was like, oh, where's everyone else? So there's a huge number of things really that I could talk about. Often our Māori and also Pacific Island students are the first in their family to go to university, and they don't actually even know what postgraduate study is. I mean, that applies to lots of students who are only doing undergrad and like kind of just don't, pursue, they don't investigate what's after that. They think they're going to do an undergrad degree and then they go and get a job, which is also perfectly legitimate. And they just don't necessarily get the education about higher education. They don't get taught about what postgrad actually is. So in my capacity as a teaching fellow, I have a big pastoral support role. And one of those jobs that I've been doing recently has been emailing all my Māori and PI Pacific Island students saying, hey, did you guys know that you could do a summer scholarship and it will be funded for you to stay here and do some work in a lab over the summer? And they're like, what does that even mean? What would I do? Who would be looking after me? So just, even doing simple things like sending an email, being like, did you know about this opportunity? I will tell you more about it if you're interested. Is really helpful for them. It's also a matter of students not seeing themselves being represented in the higher levels of academia. I am a teaching fellow, and then we have 2 Māori lecturers in our department, and that is all the Māori staff we have. And the 2 lecturers are only about my age. They've only just finished their PhDs as well, so they're not senior academics by any means, and they just don't necessarily see themselves in these jobs because they don't see anyone who looks like them in these jobs. These things are getting better and are obviously not things that can kind of change overnight. You can't just have finished a PhD and then become a professor. But that's a real thing that I've heard my students say, like, there's no other brown faces in this department at the higher levels. Things like different cultural expectations. There is a huge disparity potentially in collectivist cultures compared to Western cultures, where the whānau, the family expectations and responsibilities are huge on some of my students. They will either be needing to care for children, not necessarily even their own siblings, caring for their elders, their parents, grandparents, whoever. Big responsibilities in church, and also things like having to work part-time to support their whānau or support themselves. I think that's an issue that many students are facing currently with the cost of living situation that we have in Aotearoa. But the familial responsibilities are massive on some of these students, and they just don't have the time to invest into their undergrads, and then they might not necessarily get the grades to get into postgrad, things like that. So as part of my teaching fellow team, we're really trying to provide a bit more wraparound support for students who are in situations like that. They might be needing extensions, and I feel like things have become a lot more flexible post-COVID, but things like, oh, you need an extension because you actually had to work all week because you needed to pay for your mum's cancer treatment, or things like that. I have had situations. Things that can be kind of different to, I think, Western or more Western families. And that was kind of my main points, I think.
Very interesting. I think we see similar things at Victoria University as well, where we've got very young Māori and Pacifica academics, but that's a very new initiative and positions that have been made to sort of address those numbers as well. So I think we're slowly getting there. I've definitely seen 15 plus years of career in science, that things are changing and they're getting better. It's just the progress, and I think we just need more young people to really change things a little bit more.
Yeah, and it will never happen overnight, and I think there's definitely progress there though.
Yeah.
I might ask a question of G, if that would be all right. So you referred to the idea of sort of a pay it forward, a bit of a mentorship program. So if you were in a mentorship position, let's say for an incoming academic, just starting her own lab from overseas, based on your experience, maybe as a guide for the rest of us, what are the things you'd most have your eyes on for the things they might be struggling with, or for the signs you might look for that they are struggling and they need specific help in an area, or how would you go about that?
So I guess it depends on the stage of career. So if it's an academic lab head, I have had that experience, and I think a lot of the support they wanted was grant system, navigating the funding, because in Australia funding is everything, and it's quite different from overseas, where usually applications are followed by the same panel even after rejection. So you sort of have to appease the same people with enough rounds, whereas Australia, it's all brand new people all over again. And I think they find that quite shocking. But if it's younger people, I have to say, I try to practically help. I think it's the practical help that they need the most. So giving them space to figure out the housing situation and things like that. And also pros and cons to that, sort of highlighting what's actually normal in an Australian culture. I mentored a person from Southeast Asia, who broke down and cried in my office because she said, it's so unfair. Like, the local students have it so much easier than the overseas students because, I have to do my own laundry. So I had to gently tell her local students do their own laundry too. And that was such a revelation for her, because where she came from, she had maids. So, I think so it goes both ways, sort of trying to tell the truth of like what sort of student life is actually quite normal and what you should actually be stressed about, I guess, as well. And of course, our emotions are natural and reflexive. So you honor that, you honor how that feel, but also illustrating, what the reality is.
So I have a question here from one of our webinar participants. So Jackie, she's a question that seems a number of speakers are from Melbourne and they have positive experiences in the terms of DEI. Do you think that is also the case in other parts of Australia? So different parts of Australia experiences different?
Yeah, so Jacques, a colleague of mine.
Oh, Jacques. Oh, okay.
I was looking at that. Yeah. So I don't think we can speak on behalf of other pasts, to be honest. I think that's not very fair. Like all Australian citizens, we think we're the best. But having raised in Sydney and done my PhD, bit of postdoc there, and then moving to Melbourne, I have to say I never really felt like an Asian woman doing science or being a leader. There were a lot of leaders in Sydney that I could see that looked like me. And also it was never really raised. But I admit that actually in Melbourne, it was raised to me quite frequently that, I don't talk like my background, or usually Korean women are so timid or obedient and things like that by senior colleagues. So I don't know if Melbourne is the best either. But yeah, I'm sure each parts are slightly different in similar ways. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely agree with G. I mean, obviously, I've only ever lived in Melbourne in Australia, so I can't really speak on other states and territories, but I would assume that it is slightly different. Still probably better than some other countries, but definitely different. And I think it'd be very interesting to hear what the situation is in more remote places like the Northern Territory or Yeah, even someone didn't mention Western Australia. Yeah, even Western Australia, which is quite isolated from the rest of the world and the rest of Australia. So, yeah.
I'll add on to that. So I definitely think when it comes to things like disabilities and mental health, the largest cities are generally pretty good when it comes to that because of all the awareness that's going on, but also the accessibility of mental health care and other care. And also there's different stigmas that apply to things like mental health in the more rural communities, especially regarding men not, wanting to seek mental health and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely think it's going to be worse in rural communities in Australia. So in the centre of Australia, we'll see a very different pattern of things than we would definitely, in the larger cities where all of us, at least from Australia, are from. And I personally I've lived in Canberra and Sydney and Melbourne, and yeah, it's the same sort of patterns that we're going to see. So I wish I'd lived, elsewhere so I could, give a bit more about that. But yeah, just at least regarding
anyone on the panel, not panel, any attendees from non-East Coast can answer.
So there's another question from the audience that I think ties in with this. This is from Katarina Miranda. First, she thanks you all very much, as do we all. I'm going to paraphrase it if that's okay. Essentially, if I have this right, Katarina, and please let me know if I don't quite get it right, saying that there are these stigmas and these obstacles within academia, within our bubble, but they're probably even more severe outside of our bubble. So to what degree, in the spirit of moving all of culture and moving all of society forward, should we be focusing on getting our little house in order versus trying to influence groups beyond the universities? That's for any of you. But not all at once.
I think personally for me, I want to influence more the micro environment and also be influenced by great people around me, by listening as well, because I can also make assumptions and have stereotypes. Alex knows. But yeah, but I think if enough of us do the things that we can, we definitely have champions, right? The famous people who lead the way in a more broad change. And so I feel like we need them, and also they need us. So personally for me, it's more the micro environment I like to focus on.
I guess this gets back to something both Sophie and Alex brought up, which is that just because you're Maori, because you're gay, doesn't mean that you're responsible for moving all of society all by yourself. Maybe you just want to do your job today. And so you probably have to measure that out to some degree. Sorry, Heather, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was actually going to say at least in my stuff, because we're all talking about very different things here. So with my stuff regarding, disability and accessibility, I definitely think that everything that I've discussed so far and all the changes that can be made university-wide or institute-wide. So, not just in the neuroscience field. I definitely think that, I think that if we can start to see, at least for disability and accessibility stuff for staff, if we can start to see that everywhere, everyone's going to be happier. And a lot of the stuff I've suggested is, it's not that hard to implement in, things like having a room and educating people and all this kind of stuff and being understanding and empathetic. So I definitely think that we could go, at least, with the kind of stuff I'm talking about, go big. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Ethan said. Yeah, that's so true. Sometimes you just want to do your job for the day and not educate someone else. But yeah, it's the legislative things in New Zealand are big picture. They should be impacting everyone, whether or not people want to kind of follow down that path or not is another thing. But yeah, New Zealand is going quite big picture with a lot of their ambitions, which is fantastic. And the University of Otago has a Vision 2040 strategy that they've recently released. And it is very much into a utility partnership kind of model that they're wanting to take the university, which is fantastic, starting with the kind of new logo and things. But then there is always the catch-22 where we don't have the workforce power at those higher levels, and so you create the Vision Mātauranga policy, and then there are people who are not experts in Mātauranga who go to people who they think will probably be experts and say, oh, can you read over my thing, or can you tell me like how I need to improve this, or what do I do for this? And it's more workload. So yeah, we want to change things, but yeah, getting the workforce capacity up is kind of a huge priority, really.
Yeah, fair enough. Good.
We have a question here about a term image about double-blinded peer reviews. So how hard do you think it is to implement that? Anyone want to answer that question?
I think it's one of those things where I feel like it hurts more not to do than to do. So just do it and then see how it happens. Yeah, it's not going to be perfect. It's, maybe we can figure it out by reading the whatever, but just do it first.
Yeah.
And then
are there groups that do it? This question, this question said that ARC schemes have applied such processes. Do you know of any that actually apply the double blind process?
I actually don't know, Train, which Australian Research Council scheme did a double blind. Nothing that I've reviewed.
I was going to say this is the kind of thing that would be really great, but it's really hard, especially in Australia, because we may be a very large country, but we're actually quite small, and we pretty much all know each other in neuroscience. So and psychology, so it's kind of hard to review a grant without immediately knowing which group it's coming from.
And I can equally say that in New Zealand as well, I think, pretty much.
Yeah.
It's even smaller.
Grants may be harder, but if we can implement in journals, so it's happening more and more with journals. So I think once the journals figure it out, probably then we can somehow implement better with the grant system. But yeah, it's really important. It will be a solution to so much discrimination and bias. Like there are so many studies showing just with a female name, you get lower scores. And I actually personally think I did benefited from having a gender neutral name, at least in an Anglo sense. And then as soon as I start to be more well-known, it was very clear I was a woman. I felt like I was more discriminated. Yeah, like, because I used to get good reviews people referring to me as a he, and then I start to get poorer reviews being referred to as a she. So
So something that's happened here, I think, is most of our panel will know is for instance, in the NHMRC investigator scheme, they've simply drawn a line down the middle and say that only half of these are going to go to men and half are going to go to women, non-binary people. Do you think that's a good short-term strategy? Ultimately, we'd like to reform society so the problem doesn't exist, but in the short term, that kind of thing you think is helpful?
I have extreme views about that. I actually believe in quota system. I believe in those sort of extreme measures because sure, maybe it might not be completely fair, but considering the history of systemic bias and the lack of privilege, or all the things that women have suffered, why not just start from there and we'll figure it out. And they actually did some numbers anyway, and it turned out like it only made a difference for like a handful of grants in the end. And they did it proportionally, so it was like 50% of applicants or something like that. So it's not like women were benefited so hugely from that. So I actually really applauded that measure because we have to start somewhere. And what we forget is that nowadays, most people, the gender roles are not so strict within a family, but men often, especially, men still are who are senior and alive and doing research, they've usually had a full-time wife looking after everything but work their entire lives, being supported. Women don't usually have that. So, I think it's what I really want to see is like equal maternity, paternity leave, equal right for men to be a carer at home and not be so ambitious, get rid of toxic masculinity so that we both benefit, because men die earlier than women. Like, they are more stressed, they work more because they're under this pressure. So let women fly if they're ambitious and they want to be a leader and they want to rule the world, and let men stay home if that's what they want. Let everybody do what they want to do. And I think we'll both benefit and we'll both be healthy. But that's what I really want to see, because we can't close the gender gap without, making the gender roles more equal at home and acknowledging that kids need dads at home, not just mom. Yeah, anyway. I can go on about this. But yeah, I like the quota system and drawing the line and doing all that, because there was this systemic bias for like hundreds of years. So why not?
And I agree there's been progress in society, but nothing like level. And some pretty assertive steering, I think, is necessary until doesn't seem that
pace has been too glacial.
It's and it will be. Moving all of society is glacial. That's exactly right. Yeah, thank you.
So can I ask you what your gender balance is like at the higher level in your departments in Melbourne or wherever you are in Auckland? Is it 50-50 now? Female staff?
Not for Ethan's department.
No, I mean, I can speak to where I was at UQ and also here at the University of Melbourne. At the senior levels, it's still quite biased. And this is the scissor graph, and the right side of the scissor graph, which is the very most biased. I think basically all the universities in Australia are working to improve that, but it's a little bit glacial, and it's coming from such a disparity. And this again is an instance, and this goes back to the work with the Athena Swan framework. Where without assertive steering, you can run the numbers. It's going to be generations before it levels out. And so by all means, institute cultural change, which I think is the ultimate solution, but that is not enough, and it's not quick enough. And so that's where you need to have pretty assertive policies and procedures in place. But to answer your question, no, nowhere near level yet as senior levels.
Yeah, not on average. So only across different countries and universities, usually psychology, the senior levels are at parity, so 50-50. But other than psychology, other than things that involve mental health, it's usually all the junior researchers are women and all the senior researchers are men. I'm sure New Zealand is similar.
Yeah, we're still 16-10 men to women at the highest level, and then all the teaching fellows are women. So it's those like pastoral support, more caring roles are all women. Yeah. Well, coming through our university, we don't see very many males at all at the lower levels. It's all mostly female PhD students. The men are definitely in the minority. So I think we're going to have a very big change in 10 years' time the other way, maybe, with any...
Maybe. And that's okay, maybe. Historically, it was the other way. I don't know.
I just know I've seen a huge amount of change in the last 15 years. I had someone that was before me just a few years, went on maternity leave, and the head of school basically said, come back full-time or not at all. So she wanted to come back part-time, so she left. And I was really worried when I wanted to come back part-time. And luckily I had a very, very supportive head of school. And most of them since then have been very, very good to sort of have that blended part-time for quite a while. So I had 5-6 years of part-time, 3 days a week before I went back full-time. But there was always this pressure of, having to... you always have to keep your job, because you can't just easily get another one. You can't give up your job in academia and expect to step into another job to be available. So you have that risk of, you can't quit. You can't stop and take a big break. So I'm not sure if any of you had that experience, but... Silence.
I'm going to turn the light on.
Sure. So we have another question in the discussion from Amy Cruikshank. And this is a question for Heather regarding a term G used, stereotype threat. So how often do you find yourself performing self-surveillance? in order to preserve your academic validity, is the phrase used, as someone with a disability?
I've been looking at this question for about 5 minutes, trying to think about how to answer.
Yeah,
It's a great question. So there's kind of two parts of this. One part being that I don't believe that my mental illness makes me any lesser. I don't believe my bipolar disorder, or my autism, or my anxiety, or the disassociation, I don't believe that makes me any lesser in any way. And I actually think that having bipolar disorder and researching bipolar disorder is a major strength, and trying to tap into my lived experience actually has given me a lot of, it's been really helpful, and it's given me a unique kind of perspective into my research. So for that part, I think, you know, I don't think of myself as lesser. But when it comes to the more physical stuff, and when it comes to the fact that I'm constantly fatigued, and I often need to take time off, and I have to see doctors, and all of that, you know, the actual big parts of my disability that affect my working life, that definitely gives me that kind of, I feel like I'm lesser in that, you know, if you're going to choose between, you know, two people for a postdoc, are you going to choose the disabled person, or are you going to choose the abled person? And 100% of the time, 99% of the time, I reckon they're going to choose the able person over me. And so that's something that I'm definitely having to kind of come to terms with and think about. And yeah, me trying to be a bit more vocal about having disabilities and stuff, I know is going to cost me down the line. Like, as G was saying, you know, when you get more, I guess, prolific and out there, and people can Google your name, I reckon that's exactly what's going to start to happen to me. I'll put in a grant, they'll be like, oh, she's got bipolar disorder. I don't think so. And that could be definitely a problem down the line. So yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. I'm not sure if I've done it properly, but that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's dead on. And yeah, I mean, I guess the hope is, I agree there's progress coming, and we're going to hit a point where young researchers will come into a world where they don't need to worry about that so much. Are we there yet? I don't know. I hope we're getting there.
Me too.
Mm-hmm.
I feel bad for Carmen.
Sorry,
Alex, what did you want?
I was going to say on this is very interesting, and you're right. There's definitely a change at the moment. I mean, the MRFF, for example, is really pushing for consumer involvement, and also peer research, so having people directly with the disorder we study involved in the research. So there's definitely a change at, you know, the grant level and university level. So that's very exciting.
Right.
We have another question for Heather. So this question is wondering if you ever encountered people concerned that working the niche you have a personal stake. So because you're researching I guess bipolar mental health, whether it could bias you when it comes to developing a hypothesis or interpreting results. Is it something you're worried about?
It's something I'm very worried about. And it's something I've been thinking about when I start to publish a bit more. Do I have to put in a disclosure that I have bipolar disorder and things like that? I don't know if I do. And that's the thing is that I happen to be very vocal and be talking about, you know, having a condition like this. But how many people out there have type 1 diabetes and are researching type 1 diabetes? Has that biased them? So that's kind of the question is this going to be specific for me because it's a mental illness? Is this where this kind of idea is coming from? Or is it more about, you know, thinking about it as a whole? Like, is this, if you've had cancer and you're doing cancer research, are you biased? So I'm kind of like, I have to be careful and think about this stuff, but also like, is this just because it's a mental illness that I have? I mean, the kind of hypotheses and stuff that I have built, because what we're aiming to do in science is to see if it's correct using unbiased methods. So I think generally I would say no. You know, I've got this theory that sleep is a big part of bipolar disorder, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure that, you know, to see if my hypothesis is correct. If I've got data that goes against it, I'm going to publish that because, you know, that's what scientists do. But it is a really good question because it's something I think about all the time.
I think it's a good I think it's a good point you make. The cancer researchers, do they disclose it?
Yeah,
if they've had
exactly.
cancer? And it is. I would say it's a positive thing for being motivated to research something you're really interested in and you're passionate about. So, I mean, that's really what gets researchers to make breakthroughs, is the effort and the passion that goes into doing what you're doing. So
it's what drives every part of my PhD, is knowing that if what I'm doing might be able to make a difference and hopefully improve people, improve diagnosis, improve treatment, and stop people from going through the kind of hell that I went through when I was first diagnosed, and have gone through like a dozen different antipsychotics and all sorts of things because nothing works. So yeah, kind of drives me in that way.
Absolutely.
I also think having lived experience is like really important, or like not necessarily not vital, but can be really important depending on what you're researching as well. Like, of course, you don't want to be biasing participants or biasing quantitative results, but the ability to be like reflexive and reflective on the way that your experiences impact your area of study can be like really valuable, I think.
Yeah, I think that goes into sort of more general discussion questions, like, when you understand people's lived experiences, whether it be a mental disability, whether it be cultural thing, knowing someone to deal with these issues and what helps them makes you a lot more empathetic and be able to understand, because you don't know what you don't know. And if you haven't lived experience, or you haven't got the connections of people who've had these problems navigating, whether it be neuroscience or anything else, I think it's just really being empathetic and just really, having more lived experiences with people and sharing the struggles that people have, to be able to sort of be a bit more empathetic and I guess know what to do when people come to you and, say they have a mental health issue. And it's like, yep, so what do I need to do? And, what can they do on a day-to-day basis to make, I guess, everything easier?
Yeah, and I definitely think that applies to like mental health in particular, because a lot of research is based on, these specific diagnoses and specific symptoms that people are given that aren't actually accurate for a lot of people, especially females. That's a whole big thing. But, my experience of bipolar disorder is very different for what's actually in, the little symptomatic thing that people have. And so that's why it can be really useful. And that's why I come out with sleep, because I have had poor sleep since I was a baby, and I've recognized that as a constant issue. And that's why I've kind of gone down this path, because it's not something that people often think about.
So to pick up on what Bronwyn was just saying, to what degree is this an important part of the cultural piece, to look at the person across the desk from you or in the room with you as a human being, to try to think about them holistically, to try to see what they might be struggling with, to be empathetic toward what they might be struggling with? There are times when this cuts across the grain of more of a policy and procedural, private life stays private, work life is at work. You try not to cross that boundary. So there's a tension there. But my own feeling is you can't really be empathetic and you can't really be supportive without knowing a bit about somebody. What do y'all think about that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And to take it back to whakawhanaunga for Māori, it just doesn't work if you're a person in a lab coat and you're just wanting to take information from someone. Like, that is just not how it works. And actually, I think most people across the whole world would agree with that, whether you are an Indigenous population or not. It's same with like the healthcare system, what works best for Māori works best for everyone, actually. And it's like, who wouldn't want to have like a half-hour appointment with their GP when they get to talk and actually explain their story and their background or whatever, rather than the 10-minute in and out next person kind of thing. Like, that is the system that many rural communities are trying to implement, but like, that would be great for everyone everywhere. So I think that applies to research too. Yeah.
All right, we're about at time, but there is one question we haven't gotten to yet. So maybe I'll read that. And that's from Carmen Sandy. And then we've got another one, but maybe we should leave it here after Carmen Sandy's question. Is it useful for you to connect with groups outside of Oceania to advance actions on DEI in your communities and countries? or it may be more effective to concentrate on local national efforts. I guess this gets a little bit toward our bubble, non-bubble question before. But do you have any further thoughts from that perspective?
I think more resources, definitely the better. So yeah, connections to understand which countries have done well and which countries haven't done well. Why? I mean, it took us so long to figure out that for like 50 years, we were trying to change women, you know, to be more like men, to fix the gender issue, when actually it turned out it never worked in any country. And when people got together and talked about it, you know, actually it had to be outside the women, the system had to change. So yeah, definitely, I think if we communicated more, we will definitely not keep reinventing the wheel and keep running into the same troubles. I think that's a great idea to connect outside Oceania. And I'm pretty sure Australia, Oceania, New Zealand has a lot to offer as well. Because we're such immigrant country, like we have so many diversity and different ethnicities at different levels. So I think we have a lot to offer to other places.
And I think we have one last question. I think we have to have time for it because I think it's a really good one, Amy. So a general question: if every neuroscience department was going to have a lived experience bookshelf, which book would you nominate for inclusion to educate everybody? I can't answer that, so what's everyone's views?
I've got one here, so I'll just use that one. But it's a big read. It's called Decolonizing Methodologies, and it's by a professor called Linda Turway-Smith, and it is all about how we can make research better for everyone, but by indigenizing the way that we do research.
I think
that wasn't even
easier than a book. I think easier than a book. I think talk to people. I think with respect and gentleness and kindness to understand. I think that's probably easier, I think, than a book, if you really want to know. Sorry, I'm done.
All right. I think we're out of time, and I think the questions just started coming really in quite fast at the end. So it's really good to have some amazing questions. And I'd like to thank all our speakers today, Sophie, Alex G, and Heather, for all of the work they've put into this webinar, and Ethan for co-chairing this with me, and for ALBA and IBRO for sponsoring this and organising this fantastic webinar. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you for organising.
I shared the link in the chat, and I hope you can tell us what you thought of this webinar, because it's really important for us to get input. Thanks a lot. Have a lovely evening and day.
If anyone wants to ask about, you know, what disability and bipolar disorder and all sorts of stuff, I'm also willing to talk to anyone. And I've put my stuff in the chat, so you can contact me. And
Thank you so much. It's been nice meeting all